Hey, get off my bridge! Nah, you can stay. I kind of like you. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Off My Bridge. My name is Guy, and I have the amazing privilege of meeting up with Nathan Dowdell, who designed the 2D20 Star Trek Adventures 2 system, and pretty much everything else that's 2D20. And I caught up with him, and I asked him all about traits. How are they applicable? Now, just to catch you up, traits can be applied to your player character as things that has happened in their past. Traits can be applied to an environment as things that have or are in existence, and traits can happen during situations as well. Players can create them, and they can also try and defeat them. The GM can create them and defeat them as well, using momentum spend or threat spend. So traits are really versatile, but at the same time, they are quite expansive. So how do we manipulate, how do we work with, and all that kind of wonderful stuff is in this interview. And at the very end, Nathan even shares how he runs his own games and how he uses a particularly simple but highly effective way for tracking the traits in a scene. And let me tell you something, I'm going to be using them in my own games. Remember to hit that like button if you like this content so that we know to make more. And all of the links and references that are made in today's episode you can find in the doobly-doo down below. And now, let us open hailing frequencies. Nathan, you are the lead game designer for Modiphius, the 2D20 system, and all that kind of stuff, which means that you know everything.
Well, I think it would seem a bit self-aggrandizing to claim that I know everything, but I know enough.
Enough. Okay, good. So, in terms of how the warp core works... No, never mind. We won't go there. Because that's in the new technical manual, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, very exciting.
So I have read enough of the old TNG technical manual to be able to explain that.
Oh, I had no doubt whatsoever. None whatsoever. We are here today, though, to talk about traits, which are a major component of the 2D20 Star Trek Adventures 1 and Adventures 2 system. And they fall into a whole bunch of different categories. So they really are scattered across everything, from characters to environments to starships and all that kind of wonderful stuff. But it would be nice to get some clarity, perhaps, or some more focus, if you will, on how traits work and what the idea behind traits was. So in terms of traits, how grand can they be?
I don't tend to think of them in terms of their overall size, but they can be fairly substantial and quite all-encompassing. At its core, a trait is anything that is both true about the current scene, the current situation, and also important enough to have to be noteworthy. There could be lots of things in a scene that are true that aren't important enough to be traits. So this is always going to be distilled down to the things that are significant. And generally speaking, when it comes, so if you're moving through, say, to use an example from the shows, an abandoned Cardassian mining station. The station itself is likely to contribute a couple of traits to the situation. Because it's abandoned, the power is likely to be off, so it's going to be dark inside. That one trait by itself is fairly all-encompassing, has some fairly significant impacts. The station is of Cardassian design, so all the technology on it, all the consoles, all the computers, all the generators are of Cardassian make, which means that a character less familiar with that is likely to have problems. A character more familiar with that, which can probably get along a bit with it a bit more easily. And it being an abandoned Cardassian station, it's probably booby-trapped, which in and of itself might not do a great deal, but it could be a useful prompt later on for you as the GM to spend a few threat here and there to go, oh, but when you enter this room, this bad thing happens. Sometimes you use the traits to foreshadow rather than to do anything in and of themselves. Those are fairly big, broad, kind of fairly grandiose effects. And because of their size, it's probably going to be fairly difficult to change them. So if you're doing any action that the players want to carry out in order to change those traits, will probably you probably want to push the difficulty up a little bit, or you probably maybe want to make it a challenge or an extended task rather than just a normal task or even just a simple unrolled action. Some of those traits you won't be able to change. It's Cardassian technology. You can't change that without stripping the entire station back and rebuilding it. So that's not something that's whether changing it is within the scope of the action at all. So yes, you can do some fairly big, broad things, but in general, the bigger the effect, the more it's going to take to change it. So they become big fixtures, whereas the kinds of traits that come up a lot more often in play tend to be smaller, more discrete things that the players and NPCs and the GM can change more easily. Add a bit more dynamism to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So with regards to that, and this is something that I get asked a lot, as a GM, you are creating Terok Nor. You're creating this abandoned Cardassian mining station, and
to correct you there, the abandoned one is Empok Nor. Terok Nor is Deep Space Nine.
If we're going to go on about, I mean, yes, it was abandoned, but Terok Nor was also abandoned by the Cardassians.
It is true.
Yeah. Trek debate next week. No. So you're absolutely right. So whether it's Empok Nor or Terok Nor, the GM creates this mission, and they go, okay, right. So there's this abandoned station, and the adventurers just getting power back to the station, right? So let's assume that that's the case. They are going to have all of these predefined traits. Now, does it cost them threat to then activate those traits?
No. So the way that I have always approached it, and the way that I tend to frame it, is that when a GM is establishing a scene, the GM has unlimited authority to establish the scene however they see fit, within what is reasonable for the narrative. Obviously, this is Star Trek. If a queue is involved, anything is possible from scene to scene. But broadly speaking, when you start a scene, the GM can frame the scene and set the scene however they see fit, including scattering enemies around, applying whatever basic traits are present in that scene, based on what would be reasonable for how the situation is evolving. And that is all free. No threat needed to be spent. That's all there. Threat comes in for the GM once the scene begins. Once the players have started to take action and make decisions, and once the action has started to progress, the GM can use threat or the actions of NPCs in order to alter the scene.
Okay.
Rather than it's for change. It's for affecting change rather than creating things in whole cloth.
Right. And so, for example, the booby trap that you used, because you've established that at the beginning of the scene, then if the players then trigger said booby trap, you don't have to spend 2 threat to trigger.
So
two
in
threats
that
to
instance,
get booby trap.
In that instance, I'm using it slightly differently. I'm using the booby traps. I've established a booby traps trait at the start of the scene, and the players are aware that the Cardassians have probably left traps on board this station when they left it. That doesn't apply to any specific traps, but it does then give me permission to spend threat on effects that would come from those traps. The trait itself is there being used more as foreshadowing rather than anything else, because because the effects that they're having are a little bit more specific and targeted, and a little bit out of what you would normally expect of a trait. Okay. That's something of an exception to the rule, rather than.
Right. Okay. I think I'm sort of getting it. That you set the scene, and then when you need to do stuff that's going to radically change it or tweak it, that's then when the threat comes in. But you're using the initial traits to say, hey, this is what could be there.
Yes.
And you're giving yourself, as the GM, permission to then use it or not use it as you might need to, rather than predetermining almost like the old school where you would draw a map of the station and you'd say this room is trapped with this trap, etc., etc. You're stepping back going, there could be traps.
Yes.
And as the player's going, you're reading it, and then you go, oh, these guys have had really bad rolls. They've failed a lot. They've had to use so much stuff to try and get through this. They've got no momentum left. I don't want them to set off a booby trap because I think it will actually finish off the whole adventure. So I'm not obliged to do it because I have control over it.
You can adjust according to how things are playing out, according to what will be dramatic, what will be exciting, what would give the players a bit of a break when the dice are turning against them. However you wish to handle it. It might well be that you don't actively seek out opportunities to trigger these traps, but merely say that, okay, now you rolled 2 complications on that particular task roll. Because we know that this place is trapped, you've set off you've activated a trap during your work on that console, and now the replicators are starting to produce disruptors and blasting everyone in the room.
Yes. So that also leads to the next sort of thing, which is you are giving yourself a whole lot of support tools to be able to come up with that sort of thing on the fly.
Yes,
because complications arise. You're like, oh, what's a complication? Oh, it's just +1 difficulty. Well, that's not very interesting. It might be appropriate, but at the same time, if you've got that trait in the back of your head or on your sheet, aha, well, how can I apply that trait then? Okay,
yes,
that's lovely.
It's something actually, we've got another blog post on the subject of specifically complications coming up relatively soon. I think after the current run of tech manual blog posts is done, it's in the schedule there. And one of the points that I make in that post is that complications that make things more difficult are an easy thing to come up with, but complications that create a new challenge are often the more interesting one.
Yes,
it's not so much that this is the problem and now it's harder to solve. It's more, this is the problem and now here's another problem.
Right. Yes, that wonderful cascade that we see on every episode where it's like, 15 minutes in, right, well, we've got to ramp up the tension for the viewers, and now we're using the same sort of model. I think that's brilliant. Yeah, it's lovely. So in terms of understanding the limitations of traits, for example, Cardassians don't have secondary backup systems, whereas the Federation do, which I believe was an issue that Miles O'Brien had multiple times, and the Cardassians scoffed at that idea. Knowing that sort of thing requires a pretty good knowledge of Trek lore. So as the GM, would you say that you have to be really sharp with your lore, or because when you are creating a trait, or when a player says, I want to create a trait that I'm using, I don't know, a mechleth rather than a batleth, which, and I don't know the specific stuff. I haven't looked at the tech manual yet, but knowing the difference between the two, one's one-handed and one's two-handed, that's as far as most people kind of go. Do you think the GM has to have a robust kind of knowledge? Do you think it's something that he should, or she should throw out to their players and say, hey guys, I'm not that au fait with it? Or what are your thoughts?
I think because Trek itself is often not that consistent with those kinds of details anyway, they're often throwaway little elements that are relevant only in the moment and then move on. We know for a fact that Vulcans have an extra set of inner eyelids to protect them from bright lights. That has come up in actual Star Trek episodes twice. In about 700 episodes, or however many it is. 1,000 hours of content has come up exactly twice, and I'm pretty sure the second was a callback to the first one, the first instance.
Yes.
So it's the kind of thing where you don't actually have to be that deeply invested and deeply knowledgeable about the details. What matters more is at the table the verisimilitude of it. Does it make sense in the moment? Does it make sense for this to be the case? Does it make sense to apply this trait in this way? And sometimes for species traits and for the particular quirks and variations between different species. It can be fun just to go, oh, well, because I'm such and such species, this particular chemical or radiation, form of radiation or thing, affects me better, or affects me differently, or doesn't affect me, or affects me in a weird way, because that makes the story more interesting. And if you want to keep track of that for later so that you can call back to it, great, but those kinds of things are often very much like one and done, one episode things. Or if they do continue, they might continue in a different form, like Vulcans having a bad reaction to Trellium-D in the third season of Enterprise, which starts off as an excuse for a zombie episode, essentially, but is then used as a long-term character thread in a campaign. Arguably, that could be a one and done GM ruling that the player then goes, oh, but maybe I could use it as part of my character arc for this season. And you can kind of approach it like that. You approach it in a much more ad hoc way.
Right.
And if you want to apply every little fine detail that you've picked up off Memory Alpha, so be it. But no one's going to be, holding a phaser to your back to force you to do it.
Right. Follow the narrative. I like that.
Yes, exactly.
Traits have potency, which I think is a great idea. Again, though, who determines that level of potency? How do we work out, well, the room's on fire, potency 1, oh, the room's on fire, more, potency 2? Where does that come from? What?
So generally speaking, this is often more of a mechanical decision than it is a narrative one, at least first and foremost. Whenever you're creating a trait or changing a trait within the course of a system, within the course of a scene, typically you will create traits at potency 1, or which is essentially the default.
Right.
We don't even refer to it as having potency at that point. It's just a trait.
Yes, and that's 2 momentum.
Yes, and that's 2 momentum, and some things might make that cheaper. Circumstances might make that cheaper, certainly. Or it's come off of a difficulty 2 task or something like that. And typically speaking, if you can then stack additional instances of that trait on itself through other mechanical means, such as you've done that difficulty 2 task and then you've spent 2 momentum, now you've got a potency 2 trait. And similar can apply on the GM side of things, with the GM spending threat to change things. Create a trait for 2, spend 2 more to step it up again. That's generally the approach, but at the same time, there is this potential for using potency to reflect intensity. So, if there's fog or smoke in a scene, that might only be a single trait by itself. But if it's especially dense, you might step that up. Dense smoke 2, or blinding smoke 3, or however much you want to step it up to show just how impactful this thing is, but also to show how difficult it is to clear it out, because each one of those steps of potency is essentially its own trait. So you trying to get rid of it is going to take it step by step as well.
Right. Okay. I think
and for fire, if your example of if something's gone on fire, well, now the scene has an on fire trait, and they're always fun. But it does make sense to start it out small and then over time step it up and up and up and up, because the fire spreads and grows in intensity. Fire is ideal for that kind of dynamic.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, plasma fires, or pick a fire, something will be caught on fire. So is then being able to create a trait almost like a get out of jail free card for players? Because, for example, let's say that they're stuck in a prison, or let's continue using Deep Space Nine as our reference point. Miles, Sisko, and Jake are stuck in the ore processing facility when the station goes into shutdown because they've triggered accidentally this Cardassian protocol, and they needed to try and get out, but everything was sealed shut because it was designed exclusively for that. If the players can't come up with something, as in the episode, there was virtually nothing for them to work with. and the players are not going, oh well, maybe the ore is highly explosive. If they're not looking for that sort of thing, should it be something that they are allowed to then say, okay, well, can we create a trait, opportunity to escape type of thing?
That's possible, and in that kind of situation, I'd probably try and work with the player that wants to create the trait to. Sorry, a bit of a tickle in my throat. To try and figure out some convenient way to fit that into the narrative, to try and work with what I already know about the scene. And I'm not necessarily planning out the way out of that scene either. I tend to be a very improvisational type of GM, where I will put the problem in front of the players and let the situation unfold as the dice fall. Which means that the players' solutions are often as much as a surprise to me as they are to anybody else, which is part of the fun. So if the players don't necessarily have a clear direction on that, then yes, I'll try and work with them to try and maybe coax them in a direction that gives them an opportunity to come up with an answer on their own terms. And that, I think, just comes into more general GMing advice rather than anything specific about traits. If the players are stuck, you don't necessarily want to hand them the answer, but you certainly want to, get out the car and push a little bit.
I like that term. All right. Yes, I think that pretty much solves it. Moving on in a similar kind of vein, social combat or social engagements anyway. There is a potential for players to go, oh, well, can I create the trait that I'm just domineering? Or that I, understand Wadi culture, whereas it hasn't been on their character sheet before. Is that something that you would rule would be, yeah, right, that's worth two momentum, or how would you handle that?
So no, those kinds of things I would allow in the right sort of context, and this is the big thing with traits, is that it's all contextual. It's all, is this important in this situation, and how is it important, and how does it make an effect? Coming out of nowhere and saying my character is domineering, and this is a trait. Okay, how do you justify that? Because has your character been acting that way previously? Is this something that Is this something that you are putting on as a facade, trying to present yourself in a particular way? If we look to the episode Spock and Mark in Strange New World season 1. We've got the negotiations between that Pike and Uhura and Spock are present at, and the people being negotiated with match the energy and the demeanor of whoever is negotiating with them. So perhaps you're in a situation where, okay, you want to put on this particular front because you think it'll help you, but maybe you don't know how someone's going to respond to that. You can't necessarily guarantee that the people you're talking to will respond favorably or unfavorably to that. We've seen in early episodes of TNG, there are species who regard politeness as insulting.
Yes, that's right.
I can't think of the name of the species now, but it was someone that Wesley encountered during his academy tests.
That's right.
And we've seen with Tellarites in Enterprise in particular, that they regard insulting each other and criticism as natural ways of communicating. We've framed this in our books as being very intellectually scrupulous. They like to test and challenge ideas, and if you can't stand up to that kind of challenge, well, what kind of person are you?
Yeah, what was your idea actually worth? Yeah, absolutely.
And so, if you're going to create the trait domineering, do you know that's going to be useful to you? Do you have any way of backing up the way that you are acting beyond this being a thing, a moment of the whim? Or if it's a matter of, do you know that these people's culture? Okay, maybe it's not a focus on your character sheet, but is it something that you could have researched in advance? Is it something that you could have had a briefing on? We see in, I think it's the start of Star Trek Insurrection, joining a new species into the Federation, a big ceremony aboard the Enterprise, and Picard is being briefed on the culture of this species by Troy, which really is one of the things that she should have been doing throughout TNG.
Exactly.
That seems to be a big part of her role as counselor. Part of the reason that she's on the bridge is because she can
give insight,
get to the bottom of those diplomatic situations. And so, I'd allow you to have a trait that represents a knowledge of this particular culture. If there's a way that it could have come about organically, you spent time being briefed. Someone spent time compiling a briefing for you, or you spent time researching this, and now you've gotten this advantage. Honestly, that kind of thing is one of the advantages of traits, because you don't need to come up with specifics for all kinds of equipment and preparation and technology and support personnel and lots of things like that, when you can just go, here's a trait that covers it, because that covers 99% of the different ways that you would probably use that thing in the first place.
Right. And also cuts out, all right, what's your character doing? Well, I go and spend 3 hours sitting in the computer room learning everything. All right, give me some kind of role to see if you can remember. You don't need to do that necessarily with the trait. I also see it in social combat or in social conflict. It's also becoming a bit of a poker game, because you want to spend 2 momentum to have the domineering trait. That's great. The NPC spent 2 threat to have the resistant trait. So how much are you going to spend to make sure that you get this victory? And are you going to spend more or less type of thing?
So it also comes into things like you're not just researching the culture. Maybe you want to look into the nature of the person that you're negotiating with on the other side of the table, and seeing if, even if you're just trying to read them, read their poker face as it was, from the other side of the table, to see what they're going to respond to. You want to figure out what the best approach is. And even if Starfleet necessarily shouldn't, Starfleet personnel shouldn't get in the habit of lying. It's a notion that comes up a lot in other fiction that I enjoy, like heists and cons and capers, where the lie that is easiest to tell is the lie that someone already wants to believe.
Right.
And figuring out what lie someone wants to believe is half of the work.
Yes. Pretty much Captain Sisko's MO, I think. Lovely. Okay, well, I think that's covered all of the questions that I had kind of put together from your questions to me, as well as just sort of generally looking at traits. If you could sum up traits for you as a game master, as a tool, what kind of tool would it be for you, do you think?
So for me, traits serve the function of highlighting points and factors in a scene that are significant enough that in a TV show, the camera would focus on them. The camera would linger on those details and things like that. These are the significant pressure points of a scene. And for me and for the players, because I leave them out on index cards for all to see, they are the things that we have collected, that we have agreed that are important enough to affect the rules. So when you come at a particular task, the traits that are present are going to affect how difficult the task is, whether the task is possible, whether the task is impossible. And in situations like that, they tell us that this is important and I should make a ruling accordingly. And really, that's something that I could do as a GM anyway, but this is kind of formalizing it and having it present so that the players can engage with it too, because the players can then try and add and remove traits and play around with those and try and create traits of their own, try and change the traits that are present in the scene in order to get those kinds of rulings and benefits on their terms as well. It's also fun I use dry wipe index cards for my scene details. And if it's a complication or a negative trait that's come up, I get out a red dry white marker and write that on the card and hand that over to the player. So this is the bad thing that you are currently dealing with.
I was about to ask you.
That's always much more memorable than just telling them.
Okay. Okay, I was literally going to say, oh, wait. What do you mean you write them out on index cards for your players? So you have a stack of index cards and you're like,
yes.
Right, scene begins, you describe the scene. It's got fire, possible booby traps, Cardassian technology, right? And then you give that to the players to engage with.
I'll sit that in the middle of the table where it's visible to everybody. And if it's a trait that belongs to a particular character, a player character in the scene, I will hand them that card. So just had this in the last session a couple of days ago, beaming down onto an unknown planet, and the security officer wants to bring along a security detail. So you can certainly do that. The rules already account for it. That can count as a trait just to represent them kind of doing their thing in the background. So I write that down on the card, hand it to the security officer, and it's theirs to do with as they see fit during the course of the scene.
Very nice. And for them to remember to use them as
well. And then to remember, and it's a short-term prompt, because the moment they've been back up to the ship, those guys go back on their normal duties.
Yeah.
Or if something bad happens during the scene, we can change or wipe that card off. But it means that those things can be constantly floating around the table. They're useful for other things as well. For a collection of index cards with a few notes on them are a great way to do a quick map, because each card can be its own separate zone, and you just arrange them adjacent to each other in a little pattern.
Sort of as they need.
And that can suddenly create a very simple, very straightforward map of an area that's taken maybe 30 seconds to put together, because you don't need to be an artist to do that. It's maybe there's a little bit of doodling on there. Maybe you've just written like location traits for individual zones or the name of what's important about that zone in there, and you just scatter those in the middle of the table.
There we go.
Yeah. Things like that.
Lovely. One final question, because now you're talking how you actually run the game with the traits, which I think is absolutely wonderful. Would you ever give a player character a trait that is a permanent trait? Now, I know that you can get traits if you are wounded and you go to medical, and medical sort of has difficulty patching you up and all that kind of stuff once you've been defeated. Would you, as the GM, ever give a player a trait in the middle of a situation? So, for example, Miles O'Brien, you now have the trait of familiar or expert in Cardassian technology after, say, a couple of adventures where he's just been working on the Cardassian station.
So that's the kind of thing that if it's a permanent change to the character, I will probably discuss it with the player in that situation, as see if it's a relevant part of how they want to develop the character. I could certainly see that happening over time, and certainly you can have permanent traits. Every player character has a few of them at the top of their character sheet as well. Every starship has a few of them at the top of the character sheet. Being human, that is more or less a permanent trait for the likes of Captain Sisko.
Right.
Though Odo does at one point lose his changeling trait and replace it with human. So it's not; those aren't necessarily that as permanent as we might think. But there's certainly room for permanent traits that are extremely resistant to being changed, that you write down on a more or less permanent basis. I think in an instance like O'Brien gaining familiarity with Cardassian technology, I don't necessarily know that I'd write that as a permanent trait, but it's certainly something that he could bring, that the player of that character could bring up during a session, simply as, well, because I have been working on DS9 for however many years, and I've managed to jury rig Cardassian and Federation and Bajoran tech all into each other. Yes, I should have a familiarity with this, and we could represent that as a trait if it becomes especially crucial. I might necessarily, that could be a potential focus as well. Instead, you could, because it's that more represents, your practical skills and things like that. Whereas, I think this was an example that actually came up on the Discord the other day. Is if you've got someone that's someone that you've brought in, maybe as an NPC, as a warp theorist, an expert in warp engines. The focus that they have in warp engines probably represents their skill, their expertise, the papers they've written, and things like that about it. Having the trait of expert warp theorist could represent their skills, but it could also equally represent their reputation and how others regard them, because they are regarded as being this expert. And having those two in sync, obviously, proves that. Whereas if you've got the reputation without anything to back it up,
right,
that's a very different dynamic. And there are ways to play around with those ideas.
Fantastic. Lovely. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. I really appreciate it. And all of the articles that you were referencing, where can those be found?
So the Modiphius website has regular blog posts. So every Wednesday, I believe, we put up a new blog post for the Star Trek Adventures. At present, at the time of recording, these are ones regarding the forthcoming technical manual. But I write occasional game mechanics blog posts to explain or go into more detail about different aspects of the rules. And those get fitted to the schedule whenever there's nothing else going on. So
there we go. And links to those will be in the doobly-doo down below. So if you want more clarification on traits, it's available on the Modiphius website. Anyway, right, Nathan, thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Couldn't see it.
Wrong side. Oh, no. Yeah. What a lot of insight, what a lot of understanding, and hopefully this has helped clarify for you how you're going to use traits moving forward. I really do like his answers in terms of it's a narrative thing. It's about making it more interesting, not slowing it down, not destroying a scene, not overpowering a scene, not being mean as the GM, but rather as using it as a measuring stick to really drive forward the tension. If you like these interviews, let me know. I know you've already said that you like them after having chatted with Jim, so what should we talk about next? If you could ask any kinds of questions of the team behind Star Trek Adventures 2, what would it be? What would you ask? Well, let me know in the comments down below and we can take it from there. Until next week, I wish you and yours long life and happy gaming.